The warning in the archives. Thrall had worked in the great library of Volanthos for 30 years, and he had never seen a door like this one. The young alchemist stood in the deepest level of the ancient building where dust hung in the air like frozen time, and the lights flickered with age that predated his entire species. He had found the door by accident, while searching for old trade records that his supervisor needed for some boring diplomatic meeting. But this door was different from the others. It was black and smooth, and covered in symbols that made his 4 eyes hurt when he looked at them. Too long. The symbols belonged to the elder races, and Thrall felt his heart beat faster because the elder races had vanished thousands of years ago, and they had left behind only warnings and whispers and fear. He touched the door, and it opened inside. He found a room filled with floating screens and crystal storage devices and holographic projectors that hummed with power despite being abandoned for millennia. The first file he opened made him sit down on the cold floor. It was a warning, and it was written in every language the galaxy had ever known. Words were simple, but they carried weight that pressed down on his chest like a physical force. Should you encounter the species designated, human, do not provoke and do not threaten their young, and do not corner them, and instead you must negotiate and retreat and survive. Thrall read the words 3 times because they did not make sense to him. He knew about humans, because everyone in the galaxy knew about humans now. They were a small species from a small planet in a quiet corner of space called the Orion Arm. They had primitive ships and limited territory, and they seemed more interested in art and music and building things than in conquest or war. The Galactic Concord had been quietly taking resources from their border worlds for decades, and the humans had done nothing but send polite complaints that everyone ignored. Why would the elder races fear creatures like that? Thrall opened another file, and this one contained video recordings. First recording showed a fleet of ships that stretched across the entire screen, and they were beautiful and terrible, and they moved like a single living thing. The ships attacked the planet, and Thrall watched the world burn and crack and die in minutes. A voice in the recording spoke in a language he did not recognize, but the translation appeared below. The Vhal, the prey. Humans have responded to the Velthari attack on their colony world, and we are documenting their retaliation for future generations who must never forget what we have witnessed here. Today, Thrall felt cold. The Velthari had been one of the most powerful species in galactic history, and they had vanished completely, and no one knew why until now. He opened more files, and each one was worse than the last. Saw recordings of human soldiers walking through poisoned atmospheres without protection, because they had changed their own bodies to survive. He saw weapons that tore holes in reality itself, and ships that appeared from nowhere, and tactics that seemed to predict the future. But the worst recordings were the ones that showed human faces. They were not angry, and they were not scared, and they were not excited. They were calm and cold and empty, like machines wearing skin. One recording showed a human commander receiving news that enemies had attacked the school on a colony world. The commander did not shout or cry or show any emotion at all. He simply nodded and said 4 words that made Thrall's blood turn to ice. Wake the sleeper ships. The file ended there, but a note from an elder race scientist explained what happened next. The enemy species no longer existed, and their worlds were now asteroid fields, and the humans had hunted them for 300 years until not a single one remained alive anywhere in the universe. Thrall closed the files and sat in the dark room and tried to understand what he had learned. The elder races had fought a war with humanity thousands of years ago, and the elder races had lost, and the price of peace was a promise humanity would stay in their corner of space and the galaxy would leave them alone. But the galaxy had forgotten. The Galactic Concord had forgotten, and they had been poking and prodding and stealing from human space for years. Thrall ran to his supervisor's office and burst through the door without knocking. His supervisor was a fat old Vashani named Carl, who looked up with annoyance at the interruption. "What is the meaning of this, young one?" Trowel could barely speak, but he managed to say the words that would change everything. "We need to stop, and we need to leave. The humans alone, and we need to do it right now because the elder races left warnings, and we have been ignoring them, and something terrible is going to happen." Carl laughed and waved his hand dismissively. "The humans are harmless, and everyone knows this, and you have been reading too many old stories." Before Trowel could argue, a priority transmission appeared on Carl's screen. It was marked with the highest urgency, and it came from the Krowith Dominion. The Krowith were the most aggressive empire in the galaxy, and they had been expanding their territory for centuries, and no one could stop them. The transmission was a boastful announcement. The Krowith had blockaded a human colony world called New Helsinki, and they had taken control of the orbital stations, and they had hostages. Thrall felt his legs go weak. "How many hostages?" He whispered. Carl read the transmission and frowned. "Several thousand civilians, and also a school with about 200 children." The room was silent. Rill thought about the recordings he had seen, and the warnings he had read, and the calm, empty faces of human soldiers. Thought about what happened to species that threatened human children. "We need to warn them," Trowel said, and his voice was shaking. "Now, we need to tell the Krowith to let the hostages go and leave immediately and never return." Carl shook his head. "The Krowith do not take orders from archivists, and besides, the humans will simply surrender like they always do." Crow walked to the window and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, a species that had forgotten fear was about to remember it somewhere. Out there, the galaxy was about to learn why the elder races had sealed those files and hidden those warnings, and prayed that no one would ever be foolish enough to wake the sleeping giant. The humans had been peaceful for thousands of years, but peace was a choice, and choices could be changed, and the Krowith had just given humanity a very good reason to choose differently. The Krowith mistake. Fleet Commander Voxer stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Dominance, and looked down at the small blue world below. New Helsinki was a beautiful planet with green forests and deep oceans and cities that sparkled like jewels in the sunlight. It would make an excellent addition to the Krowith Dominion. Voxer was proud of himself because this operation had been his idea from the start. He had studied the humans for years, and he had concluded that they were weak and soft and easy to conquer. His intelligence reports showed that they had only a handful of old warships, and their military spending was almost nothing compared to real powers like the Krowith. Spent their resources on hospitals and schools and parks and art museums instead of weapons and soldiers. Voxer thought this was pathetic, and he knew that pathetic species deserved to be conquered by stronger ones. That was the law of the universe, and the Krowith had always understood this truth. He had positioned his fleet around New Helsinki 3 days ago, and he had broadcast his demands to the human government. Terms were simple and generous in his opinion. The humans would surrender all their colony worlds to the Krowith Dominion, and they would provide workers for Krowith factories, and they would pay tribute every year forever. In exchange, the Krowith would allow them to continue existing. The human response had been strange and unexpected. They had not surrendered, and they had not attacked, and they had simply asked for time to evacuate civilians from the planet. Voxer had laughed when he received this message. He saw it as proof of human weakness, and he decided to show them what happened to species that wasted his time. Ordered his ships to destroy the orbital hospital that floated above the planet's northern continent. The hospital had held 3,000 patients and 500 medical staff, and it had vanished in a flash of light that lasted less than a second. Voxer expected screaming and crying and begging after this demonstration. Instead, he got silence. The humans stopped responding to his messages, and their communication channels went dark, and their ships powered down and drifted without apparent purpose. Evisa was confused, but not worried. He assumed they were simply too shocked to respond. and he decided to give them a few hours to process their defeat. Before demanding their final surrender, he retired to his private quarters for a meal and a rest. He did not notice the old Krowith veteran who served as his third officer, quietly packing his belongings and transferring to an escape pod. The veteran's name was Gorith, and he was 140 years old, and he remembered stories his grandfather had told him, stories about a war that happened before the Krowith had spaceflight stories, about creatures from a distant star who had come to help the Krowith's ancient enemies. Stories about what those creatures did when someone hurt their familiar Gorith. Had always thought the stories were myths, but now he was not so sure. He had seen the look on the human ambassador's face when the hospital exploded. There had been no fear and no anger and no sadness. There had been nothing at all, and that nothing was the most terrifying thing Gorith had ever seen. He launched his escape pod and set course for the edge of the system, and he did not look back on. The planet below, a human woman named Catherine Joe sat in a dark room and watched the footage of the hospital's destruction. Catherine was 67 years old, and she had white hair and kind eyes, and she had spent her entire life building things instead of destroying them. She was an admiral in the Human Defense Force, but she had never fired a weapon in combat because there had never been a need. Humans preferred peace, and they were good at peace, and they had thought the galaxy understood this, but humans were also good at other things. Things they did not like to talk about, things they kept locked away in the dark parts of their history and their hearts. Catherine watched the footage again, and she saw the names of the dead scrolling across the screen. One name made her stop breathing. Elena Joe, age 7, patient in the Children's Recovery Ward, granddaughter of Admiral Catherine Joe. Catherine sat very still for a long time. Then she stood up and walked to her command console and entered a code that had not been used in 4,000 years. Across human space, something woke up in asteroid fields and hidden stations and secret facilities that did not appear on any map. Ancient machines began to power on ships that had been sleeping for millennia, opened their eyes and stretched their weapons and remembered what they were built to do. In 100 worlds, human citizens received a single message on their personal devices. The message showed the hospital exploding, and it showed the list of the dead, and it showed the face of Fleet Commander Voxer laughing as he gave the order. Then the message asked a simple question: what would you like us to do about this? The response was unanimous. In homes and offices and factories and schools, humans stopped what they were doing, and they answered with a single word: everything. Voxer was still eating his meal when his second officer burst into his quarters with a face that had turned pale gray. Commander, we have a problem. Voxer looked up with annoyance. What kind of problem? Sensor contacts, sir, and they are appearing from behind the moon. How many ships? The second officer swallowed hard. We stopped counting at 3,000 and they are still appearing. Voxer dropped his food and ran to the bridge. Through the view screen, he saw something that made his blood turn cold. The dark side of the moon was lighting up with engine signatures and weapon signatures and shield signatures. Ships were appearing from nowhere, and they were all human, and they were all pointing their weapons at his fleet, and they were all completely silent. No demands and no threats and no warnings. Just thousands of ships waiting in the dark like predators about to strike. A Voxer realized in that moment that he had made a terrible mistake. He had studied human economics and human politics and human culture, but he had not studied human history, and human history was full of monsters. The Wrath response, the battle for New Helsinki, lasted exactly 19 hours, and it was not really a battle at all. It was an execution. Voxer had 300 warships under his force command, and each one was equipped with the finest weapons and shields and armor that the Krowith Dominion could build. The humans had thousands of ships, but many of them were small and old and looked like they had been pulled from museums and junkyards. Voxer thought he could win if he struck first and struck hard. he was wrong. The human fleet moved like nothing Voxer had ever seen before. They did not fly in formation like normal ships, and they did not follow predictable patterns, and they did not behave like individual vessels at all. They moved like a swarm of insects, or like the fingers of a single giant hand, or like drops of water flowing around obstacles every time a Krowith ship fired. At one human vessel, a dozen others would appear from unexpected angles and tear at Voxer watched his fleet die piece by piece, and he could not understand how it was happening. His tactical officers were screaming about impossible maneuvers and weapons that should not exist, and ships that appeared inside his own formations without warning. One human destroyer materialized directly behind the Eternal Dominance and fired a single shot that disabled the flagship's engines before vanishing again. Voxer screamed for his ships to concentrate fire and to hold formation and to fight back, but there was nothing to fight. Humans were everywhere and nowhere, and they struck without warning and disappeared before anyone could respond. After 6 hours, half of Voxer's fleet was drifting wreckage. After 12 hours only, 50 ships remained operational. After 18 hours, Voxer was alone on a crippled flagship, surrounded by the corpses of his crew. He tried to surrender 7 times during the battle. The humans did not respond to any of his messages. Finally, after 19 hours, a human voice came through his communication system. It was a woman's voice, and it was calm and cold and empty of any emotion. Fleet Commander Voxer of the Krowith Dominion, you are now a prisoner of the Human Defense Force, and you will be taken to face justice for your crimes against our people. Voxer felt hope surge in his chest. Prisoners had rights, and prisoners could negotiate, and prisoners could survive. I surrender completely, and I will cooperate fully, and I will tell you anything you want to know. Good. The human voice paused and then continued. You touched the children. The communication ended an hour later. Human Marines boarded what remained of the Eternal Dominance. Voxer had expected soldiers in heavy armor carrying massive weapons. Instead, he saw humans in simple black uniforms walking calmly through the wreckage of his ship. They did not shout or threaten or celebrate their victory. They simply moved from room to room, collecting survivors and separating them into groups. One Marine approached Voxer and looked at him with eyes that held no hatred and no anger and no mercy. You are the commander, Voxer nodded. Yes, and I am surrendering. And I demand to be treated according to the conventions of war. The Marine tilted her head slightly. Conventions of war are for wars between civilized peoples, and what you did was not war, and it was murder, and you murdered children. I did not personally give that order, and I was following the commands of my superiors, and I was just doing my duty. The Marine smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing Voxer had ever seen. Then we will visit your superiors next. Voxer was taken to a holding cell on a human ship, and he waited there for days wondering what would happen to him. Through the small window of his cell, he could see human ships gathering in formation, but they were not preparing to leave. They were preparing to move deeper into Krowith space. On the bridge of the command ship, Admiral Catherine Joe reviewed the intelligence that Krowith prisoners had provided. She now knew the location of every Krowith military base and every shipyard and every command center. She knew where the Krowith leadership lived and where they worked and where they felt safe. She turned to her communications officer. Open a channel to all human forces. The officer nodded, and a moment later, Catherine's voice was heard by every human ship in the fleet. This is Admiral Joe, and I am speaking to all personnel participating in operation. Reminder, and our objectives are clear, and our purpose is just. And our enemy has shown us who they are, and now we will show them who we are. She paused and looked at the stars beyond the view screen. 4,000 years ago, humanity made a promise to stay in our corner of space and to live in peace and to let the galaxy forget what we could do, and we kept that promise because we wanted to be more than our ancestors, and we wanted to build instead of destroy. Her voice hardened, but some things cannot be forgiven and some lines cannot be crossed. And the Krowith crossed every line that matters, and they killed our children, and they laughed while doing it. Catherine thought of her granddaughter Elena, who had been in that hospital for a simple surgery that would have taken an hour. Elena, who loved to paint and sing and chase butterflies in the garden. Elena, who would never grow up now. The Krowith Dominion has existed for 3,000 years, and they have conquered 100 species, and they have never known defeat. Admiral Joe smiled, and it was the same smile the Marine had shown Voxer. That changes today, and by tomorrow the Krowith will learn why the elder races feared humanity and why they told everyone in the galaxy to never corner the U.S. and why they sealed our history away and hoped no one would ever be foolish enough to wake us up. She straightened in her chair. All ships advance to the Krowith homeworld and show no mercy until they show remorse and remind them what happens when you hurt our families. The human fleet moved as one, and the stars trembled, and somewhere in the archives of Valanthos, young Trell felt a chill run down his spine, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. The humans were awake, and they were angry. The transmission reached every corner of the galaxy at the same time. It appeared on government channels and military networks and civilian broadcasts and personal devices. Every species in the Galactic Concord stopped what they were doing and watched. The image showed a throne room that every spacefaring species recognized. It was the Hall of Dominion on Krowith Prime, where the Supreme Council had ruled their empire for 3,000 years. But the Supreme Council was no longer ruling anything. The 12 members of the council lay dead on the floor around their ancient throne, and their blood stained the marble tiles that countless conquered species had been forced to polish with their own hands. Standing in the center of the room was a human woman with white hair and cold eyes, Admiral Catherine. Joe looked directly into the camera and spoke in a voice that carried across 10,000 light years. My name is Admiral Catherine Joe of the Human Defense Force, and 3 days ago, the Krowith Dominion attacked our colony world of New Helsinki, and they destroyed a hospital filled with innocent people, and they took our children as hostages. She paused, and her eyes seemed to look through the camera and into the souls of everyone watching. 47,000 years ago, your ancestors made an agreement with mine, and the terms were simple, and they were fair. And they asked only one thing of the galaxy. Leave us alone. Catherine stepped over the body of a dead Krowith lord without looking down. For thousands of years, we kept our part of the bargain, and we stayed in our corner of space, and we built our civilization in peace. And we watched the galaxy grow and expand, and we did not interfere. We asked only to be left alone. Her voice hardened. But you did not leave us alone. And you took our resources, and you insulted our diplomats, and you tested our borders, and we tolerated all of this because we understood that the galaxy had forgotten, and because we did not want to remind you. But then the Krowith killed our children. Catherine gestured at the destruction around her. This is what happens when you kill our children, and this is not a threat, and this is not a warning, and this is simply a fact of the universe that every species must understand. The Krowith Dominion ruled 12 star systems and commanded 80 billion souls, and they were the most feared military power in the galaxy. It took us 72 hours to reach there. Homeworld and another 6 hours to end their government. She let that sink in before continuing. We did not want this, and we do not enjoy this, and we take no pleasure in destruction and violence and death. But we will not apologize for it either. The elder races understood something that the younger species have forgotten, and that truth is simple, and it is this. Humanity is not a threat to anyone who leaves us in peace, but humanity is the end of anyone who threatens what we love. Catherine walked to a window and looked out at the burning sky of Krowith Prime. In the ancient records, the elder races called our response to attacks on our families the Wrath response, and they studied it for centuries trying to understand it, and they never did. They could not understand how a species that loves music and art and poetry could transform into perfect killing machines when their children are threatened. They could not understand how creatures that cry at sad stories and laugh at silly jokes could become cold and merciless and relentless when their families are in danger. They could not understand because they had never evolved on a world like Earth where everything wanted to eat you and where survival depended on being willing to do anything to protect your tribe. She turned back to the camera. Let me be clear about what happens next, and let me be clear about what we expect from the galaxy. We are returning to our space, and we are taking our ships and our soldiers and our weapons with us, and we will go back to building hospitals and schools and parks. And we will go back to making music and art. And we will go back to raising our children in peace. But we will be watching. The archives the elder races left behind contain records of every species in this galaxy, and every government and every military. We have read those archives now, and we know who has been stealing from our border worlds, and we know who has been planning to follow in the Krowith's footsteps. You know who you are. Catherine smiled, and it was not a kind smile. You have one standard year to make things right, and to return what you have taken and to abandon your plans against us. After 1 year, we will evaluate the situation. If we are satisfied, then we will return to sleep, and the galaxy can continue as before, and everyone can pretend that humanity is just another small peaceful species in a quiet corner of space. If we are not satisfied, then we will remind you again, and the reminder will be worse because we do not like repeating ourselves. The camera pulled back to show the full scope of the destruction human. Marines stood at attention throughout the throne room, and human ships filled the sky outside, and human boots walked the streets of the Krowith capital. One final message for anyone thinking about revenge or retaliation, or trying to hurt us before we can hurt you. Catherine's voice dropped to almost a whisper. The fleet you see here is our defensive force, and these are the ships we use to protect our colonies and respond to emergencies. Our actual military has been asleep for 4,000 years, and we have not woken them yet. Pray that we never do. The transmission ended in the great hall of the Galactic Concord. Representatives of 1,000 species sat in stunned silence. Some were terrified, and some were relieved, and some were already calculating how quickly they could return stolen goods and cancel invasion. Planned young Trowell watched from the archives and felt something strange in his chest. It took him a moment to recognize the feeling. It was hope, because the humans had not destroyed everything, and they had not conquered anyone, and they had simply reminded the galaxy of a promise that should never have been broken. Maybe, just maybe, the galaxy could learn from this. Maybe the old peace could be restored. Maybe humanity really would go back to sleep. Thrall looked down at the ancient records in his hands. He hoped the galaxy was wise enough to let them. The new understanding 6 months had passed since the fall of the Krowith Dominion, and the galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. Ambassador David Okonkwo walked slowly through the great hall of the Galactic Concord, leaning on his wooden cane and taking his time with each step. He was 73 years old, and he had white hair that curled softly around his dark brown face, and he had eyes that crinkled when he smiled, and hands that shook slightly when he gestured. He looked like someone's grandfather because he was, and he had 4 grandchildren who loved him very much and who sent him drawings and messages every day. He did not look like a representative of the species that had terrified the galaxy. That was exactly why humanity had chosen him. David reached the speaker's platform and looked out at the assembled representatives of 1,000 worlds, and he saw fear in their eyes and distrust and confusion. But he also saw something else. He saw curiosity. Thank you for allowing me to address this assembly, and I know that many of you are afraid, and I know that the last 6 months have been difficult and confusing for everyone. He smiled gently. I want to start by telling you about my planet and about my people and about who we really are. David pressed a button and an image of Earth appeared behind him. This is our home, and it is a small world covered mostly in water and orbiting an ordinary star in an unremarkable part of the galaxy. But Earth is not an easy place to live. The image changed to show prehistoric humans huddling in caves while predators prowled outside. When my species first evolved, we were not the strongest creatures on our planet, and we were not the fastest, and we did not have sharp claws or thick armor or venomous bites. We had only 2 things, and those were our brains and each other. The image changed again to show humans hunting together and building shelters and caring for their wounded. We survived because we learned to work together, and because we would do anything to protect our families and our tribes and our children. Anything at all. David let that statement hang in the air for a moment. Over thousands of years, we built civilizations, and we created art and music and literature and science. And we developed technology that let us reach for the stars. But we also fought terrible wars among ourselves. And we did horrible things to each other, and we nearly destroyed our own world more than once. He shook his head sadly. We are not proud of everything in our history, and there are chapters we wish we could erase, and lessons we learned in blood that we pray we never forget. But through all of it, one thing remained constant, and one truth defined who we are as a species. David looked directly at the assembled representatives. We protect our families, and we protect our children, and if you threaten them, we will become something that you do not want to see. Not because we enjoy violence, but because we cannot be anything else when those we love are in danger. The room was completely silent. The elder races understood this about us, and they learned it the hard way. And when the ancient war ended, they made a simple agreement with humanity. We would stay in our corner of space, and we would live in peace, and we would let the galaxy forget what we could do. In exchange, the galaxy would leave us alone. David's expression grew serious. For 47,000 years we kept that promise, and for 47,000 years we hoped that we would never need to break it. But your descendants forgot, and they pushed and they prodded and they stole and they ignored our protests. And then the Krowith killed our children. He closed his eyes for a moment. I have a granddaughter named Amara, and she is 7 years old, and she loves to dance, and she asked me to tell her stories about the stars every night before bed. When I heard about what happened at New Helsinki, I thought about Amara, and I thought about what I would do if someone hurt her, and I understood why Admiral Joe did what she did. David opened his eyes. We do not want war, and we do not want conquest, and we do not want your planets, or your resources, or your submission. We want to go home and hug our children and build things and make music and explore the universe in peace. But we will never again allow anyone to threaten what we love. He tapped his cane on the floor for emphasis. This is not a threat, and this is a simple statement of fact, and it is who we are as a species. The elder races called us the monster that kills other monsters. And they were right. But they only told half the story. We are also the species that builds hospitals for other species, and that creates art that makes strangers cry, and that adopts orphans from worlds we have never visited. We are capable of terrible destruction, and we are capable of profound love, and both of these things are equally true. David smiled warmly. Today, I am asking this assembly to formalize a new agreement between humanity and the Galactic Concord. We will share our technology with species that wish to learn from us, and we will trade fairly, and we will help those who ask for help. In exchange, you will respect our borders, and you will leave our families in peace, and you will remember the lesson that the Krowith learned. If you do these things, then you will find no better friend in the galaxy than humanity, and our children will play with your children, and our artists will create with your artists, and our scientists will discover with your scientists. He paused. But if you do not do these things, and if you threaten our families, and our homes and our children, David's kind eyes grew hard for just a moment. Then you will find no worse enemy. The vote was unanimous. The Galactic Concord formally recognized human sovereignty and established diplomatic relations and enshrined the Elder Warning into galactic law in the archives of Valanthos Young. Trial added a new entry to the ancient sealed files. The humans woke and they judged, and they returned to sleep, and may we be wise enough to let them dream on New Helsinki. The school had been rebuilt in a beautiful valley surrounded by flowering trees. Children of many species played together in the courtyard, and their laughter echoed across the hills, and their joy filled the air. Like music, a human girl with dark, curly hair taught a young Krowith orphan how to catch a ball, and when the Krowith child finally caught it, they both cheered and hugged and ran off to play another game. The Krowith child's name was Varks, and he had been adopted by a human family after the war, and he did not remember his birth parents, and he did not care. He had a family now, and he was loved, and that was all that mattered. Overhead, a single human patrol ship passed silently through the sky, watching, waiting, ready, but hoping it would never be needed, because humanity had learned something in the long millennia since they first looked up at the stars. The greatest victory was not winning a war. The greatest victory was making war unnecessary. And as the children played beneath the endless sky, the galaxy slowly began to remember something it had forgotten. Peace was precious, and some guardians were worth trusting the end.